What if we could stop a heart attack or a stroke just by flipping a tiny switch inside our own bodies? Well, it sounds like science fiction, but researchers might have just found that exact switch. It's a tiny protein inside our blood platelets, and it seems to be the master control for clotting. Honestly, this could change everything.
And really, it all boils down to solving this one huge problem. Every single day, doctors are walking this tightrope. How do you prevent a deadly blood clot from forming in someone's arteries without also turning off their body's ability to stop bleeding when they get injured? It's an incredibly high-stakes dilemma.
So here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll get into the problem itself, the clotting conundrum. Then we'll introduce our new suspect, a protein called CK1. We're going to see what happens when scientists flip its off switch, figure out its double action mechanism, and then finally ask the big question. Does this point to a safer future for anti-clotting medicine?
Okay, let's just dive right in. We've got this process in our bodies that is absolutely vital for keeping us alive. But under the wrong set of circumstances, it can become incredibly dangerous. It's really a tale of two different kinds of clots. On one side, you've got the good clot, which is called hemostasis. So you get a cut, and your platelets, these little first responders, rush to the scene, form a plug, and you stop bleeding. Perfect, life-saving. But then there's the bad clot, thrombosis. This is when those same platelets go haywire and form a plug inside a blood vessel, cutting off blood flow to the heart or the brain. Same process, but a totally disastrous result. And that brings us right to the core of this dilemma. See, the drugs we use right now, they're basically hammers. They're great at smashing the bad clots, but they do it by taking out the entire clotting system. And that means a patient on these drugs is also way more vulnerable to serious bleeding from a simple injury. It's a huge risk. So if the current drugs are a hammer, what researchers have been desperately searching for is a scalpel, something precise that can target just the bad clots and leave the good ones alone. And that hunt has led them to a fascinating new suspect, a protein called casein kinase 1, or just CK1 for short.
Now, CK1 itself isn't new. Scientists have known about it for a while. You can think of it as a kind of cellular middle manager. It's all over the body, handling important jobs. But what exactly it was doing inside our platelets, that part was a complete mystery.
The way they went about figuring this out was actually pretty brilliant in its simplicity. They knew CK1 was in the platelets, they just didn't know what its job was. So they used a special drug to block it, to inhibit its function. Basically, their plan was to turn it off and just see what happened, see what broke. And what they found? Well, it was a really big deal. This wasn't some minor effect. Turning off this one single protein sent shockwaves through the entire system that activates platelets.
Yeah, the results were anything but subtle. As soon as they blocked CK1, the platelets just became way less reactive. Their ability to do all the key things they need to do to form a clot was seriously impaired, right across the board. Let's look at some of the actual data. First, let's talk about aggregation. That's just a fancy word for the platelets' ability to clump together. With CK1 blocked, that ability dropped significantly. The platelets just weren't as sticky anymore. And here's the why behind that. For platelets to stick to each other, they have to put out these tiny little molecular grappling hooks. Well, when CK1 was turned off, the activation of those grappling hooks plummeted by a staggering 68.5%. The platelets just couldn't grab onto each other anymore. So that raises a pretty big question, right? How can one little protein have such a massive impact? Well, it turns out CK1 isn't just pulling a single lever. It's more like a master switch with two functions. It controls both the ignition to start the process and the fuel supply to keep it going. So first, let's talk about the ignition. CK1 is like the key. It kicks off a chain reaction. It turns on a protein called RIPK3, which then turns on another one called MLK. And that little cascade is what unleashes the platelet's full power to form a clot. So if CK1 doesn't turn that key, the engine never really gets started. Okay, so the second part of this whole thing involves the platelet's energy source. Now, platelets have these tiny little power plants inside them called mitochondria. They're what generate all the energy for the cell to do its work. And what the researchers found was that CK1 is also crucial for keeping these little power plants running at full steam. When you block CK1, the mitochondria start to fail, and that starves the platelet of the energy it needs to actually form a clot. So, CK1 not only starts the engine, it also makes sure there's enough gas in the tank. It's a two-for-one deal. So we've got this one protein that controls both the ignition and the fuel for clotting. But the real question is, does any of this matter in a living system? Can it solve that real-world problem for doctors and patients? Well, the answer to that is what makes this discovery so incredibly exciting.
So the researchers took their experiments out of the petri dish and into mice. They basically created a situation where a dangerous clot would form in an artery, and then watched what happened to the mice that were treated with the CK1 inhibitor. And the result was truly remarkable.
And what you're seeing here is basically the holy grail of anti-clotting therapy. On one side, the formation of those dangerous clots, thrombosis, was slashed. The clot growth rate dropped by over 64%. But, and this is the really amazing part, on the other side, normal clotting, the good kinds you need to heal, was completely untouched. The mice could still stop bleeding from a cut just fine. They had found a way to selectively turn off the bad clot without affecting the good one. This discovery makes CK1 a really promising target for developing smarter and much safer anti-clotting drugs. I mean, the authors of the study themselves wrapped it up perfectly, saying CK1 may potentially serve as a promising target for therapeutic intervention against thrombotic disorders. So, we're left with this incredible possibility. For decades, we've been using hammers to treat blood clots. This research suggests we may have finally found a scalpel. Could targeting this one elegant little power switch be the key to preventing heart attacks and strokes, but without that dangerous risk of bleeding? All the science so far seems to be pointing to a resounding yes.